So what my hope is, Barbara said that I teased you a little bit about this issue the other day, but what we're hoping is that what we're going to talk about today is both got obvious links to many of the themes that you've already been discussing this week at APORDE, and we'll carry on doing so next week as well, but that it's actually quite different from what people often think about and discuss when they're thinking through industrial policy and so on. And so this is about what we call the industrialization of freshness. We're going to talk about that. We'll say what we mean by that more specifically as we go through. But let's start by talking about the role of agriculture very briefly in the process of structural change and economic development. What do we know from the facts? And then how have people interpreted what appear to be the clearest facts? And the most obvious thing, I now can't, there we go, okay, that's what works, is to say that, to do this by quoting Timmer, to show that the historical record is very, very clear, is that all successful developing countries undergo a structural transformation that involves a falling share of agriculture in economic output and in employment. So over time, as countries get richer per capita, there's a smaller and smaller share of people employed in agriculture and a smaller share of final output of GDP accounted for by agriculture. Let's see that. Let's see what that looks like historically. Now, there's lots of ways of showing this. You might just want to take a little bit of time to think through what's going on in this slide, which is focusing more on the employment. So on the x-axis, as we move towards the right, we're getting richer in terms of GDP per capita. And as you do that, as countries do that over time, on the y-axis, their share of agriculture in employment is falling. And you see, so if you pick up the red line, for example, at the top, and on top left, and you'll see it starts around 1955, because it's not good enough data going back before that. And you see a very, very dramatic fall. You follow that red line all the way to where it is, which is South Korea. Okay, a very dramatic shrinkage in the share of agriculture in employment data in South Korea. Important to know that whilst that's happening, in fact, South Korea remains a very, very sophisticated agricultural producer and exporter. And you look elsewhere, and you look at the longer run change in the UK, in the yellow line at the bottom. So that starts in 1801, when already the share of people employed in agriculture is smaller in the UK, but it continues to fall until the 2000s, 2015 or so. So you'll see all sorts of squiggly lines in the background. You can go to our world in data, you can find this chart, you can play around and isolate, for example, Zambia or Nigeria more clearly. But let's just look at Ethiopia up here, where we've got data from 1961 for Ethiopia. And that's suggesting that the process is not always a very neat, straight line. It might be a function of the data, it might be a function of politics, policy, all sorts of things, but nonetheless, the same overall structural change has been taking place in Ethiopia, although, as you notice, by 2015, still a very large share of employment is accounted for by people employed in agriculture. So that's the overall position there. The green line, by the way, here from 1950 onwards is Brazil, which we'll talk about briefly as we carry on this morning. So that's one way of capturing this long run shift in the role of agriculture in the overall economy, or what it seems to look like. So how have people interpreted that data? John, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, just before you go on to can we go back to the previous slide?
My God, yes, we can. There we go. Thanks.
Just to make a really obvious point, and I'm sorry if I'm stupid about this, the implication of this is that labor productivity in agriculture is rising, that fewer people are managing to produce the output. all right, agricultural output as a share of GDP will be falling in a similar way to the way that employment share has been falling. But even so, agricultural output has been rising or steady in many countries. And if the share of the labor force that is agricultural has been falling, it implies logically that there has been an increase in labor productivity in agriculture in the process of economic development. And that's a rather important point to make, that it's unlikely that you'll ever see any process of economic development that doesn't involve rising agricultural labor productivity. And the second point is one we hammer on about and bore everybody about, which is that the quality of labor market statistics for all these countries, including the UK or the US, but for all countries, especially poorer countries, is appalling. We might be able to say something with some confidence about the broad outlines, the broad trend as shown in this chart, but the truth is that many of the squeals just reflect changes in survey tech methods and that sort of thing. Okay, that's my pennyworth on that slide.
Okay. Why don't you carry on a bit with this?
Okay. One of the ways in which people sometimes think about this data, about the falling share of agriculture in output and agriculture in total employment, is that in a fast-growing economy, there's structural change. So all movements towards higher productivity sectors or activities are equivalent to a move away from agriculture. In other words, one's not looking here often people don't look at the shift of the labor force from agriculture to non-agriculture, but they look at, or they interpret that as a move away from low productivity to high productivity, or vice versa. In a sense, you then get the idea that agriculture doesn't matter, that if you're growing fast, agriculture should become less important. Perhaps there's less need for investment in agriculture. So one interpretation of these trends is that agriculture is of declining significance and that really policymakers ought to focus on things other than agriculture. Agriculture's contribution is falling and there's less need for investment in agriculture. And perhaps the most significant or dominant strand in this thinking is some doubts about whether agricultural exports make much sense. There is a large literature, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, from Prebisch onwards, Prebisch-Singer theories, which suggest that there are adverse movements against the price, against primary commodity export prices. Terms of trade move against them. It becomes less and less worthwhile to engage in agricultural exports. What you really want to do if you want to be a successful exporter is to move into the export of manufactures, and a pessimism about agricultural exports and the declining prices of terms of trade for agricultural exports has become very influential, or has been very influential amongst some policymakers for a long time. But I think somebody on day one of APORDE said there's starting to be a realization that some agricultural activities may be inspired by industrial activities.
Yeah,
it raises a question. Sorry, go, Chris.
No, go. You go ahead, John. I'll come in a second.
Well, it raises the question, what do we mean by industrial activities and what do we mean by agricultural activities? Since the policy implications seem to be so important about the allocation of investment resources, policy priorities, if there's pessimism about agricultural commodity exports, if there's pessimism about the role that agriculture can play in the growth process, then what do we mean by agriculture and what do we mean by industrial activities?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I picked up when I was doing the lecture with Nicolas Pons-Vignon on Monday, where he was referring to the stuff that John and I are thinking about and discussing this morning. And he said, well, look, you know, increasingly maybe people think that a lot of agriculture is inspired by industrial activities. We think that's misleading. That's not getting what we're saying. That's why I'm emphasizing that thing about inspired by. What we want to go on and show you is that we think something more profound than just being inspired indirectly by industrial activities is going on. So think about that. So contrary to this, we want to kind of remind you that the process of structural change can happen within agriculture if we think of it in terms of a shift from low to higher productivity. And that can happen at different levels before we talk about what constitutes the industrial. You can think at quite a limited level in rural Ethiopian coffee growing areas, for example. There is a lot of scope for raising productivity in coffee output by simple measures of kind of cleaning around the coffee trees and so on and so forth, right? So there are fairly straightforward, simple measures that can be taken to raise productivity there. But that happens everywhere. That's kind of possibly a little bit limited. But look at the difference with what you can achieve in terms of economies of scale with extraordinarily high levels of yield in the same crop in coffee in Brazil, where we find very, very different organization of coffee production. And we find that a single hectare of irrigated coffee in the Cerrado in northern Brazil can produce 80 bags of coffee, 5 or 6 times the amount produced on even the very best coffee farms in Central America. And that in turn, unfortunately, is quite a bit higher probably than the yield in much of Ethiopia. So that's the beginning. Well, what's going on behind that is it just irrigation or is there something a little bit more going on? That leads us slightly into our discussion of of policy and of industrial policy and what we understand by the industrial. Do you want to talk about that or shall I for a bit, John?
You carry on.
So lots of people, I don't need to talk about this at length because lots of people during APORDE tell you about industrial policy. And it's a long, old tradition within particularly non-mainstream, heterodox development economics, which is to say that there is something to identify, something very, very unique and special about manufacturing industry and the role that that plays in structural transformation. We can capture that most obviously. I don't need to go through them again. You've probably heard them certainly once and probably more than that this week already, which is Kaldor's 3 growth laws about the relationship between growing levels of output in manufacturing and productivity, both within manufacturing and outside manufacturing. And important also to emphasize that Tony Thirlwall, building on Kaldor's growth laws, emphasized the significance of the balance of payments and the role of manufactured exports. As Thirlwall puts it, what you produce and what you export matters quite a lot because of the different demand properties and production characteristics of different economic outputs in the economy. So from that, we derive the idea that well, maybe if there's something special about manufacturing, then maybe there's a role for governments to intervene in order to promote these manufacturing, these industrial activities, in order to accelerate the overall process of structural change. Arguably, that's not the only thing that industrial policy is for. Industrial policy may have an academic, an empirical and theoretical foundation like that, but it also has a political role. industrial policy can be a very useful way of for governments of showing that their country, their government, their regime is committed to these prestige projects, these big showy factories and industrial parks. And these things are very, very visible compared to interventions to raise yields on farms in the distant rural areas of a country. It's much easier to focus media attention, global attention on big turnkey factories on the edges of cities and so on and so forth. Okay, so we need to remember that. And it plays a big role in whether you're thinking about Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, whatever. Is we are interested, as people interested in policy interventions, in what the most effective allocation of resources and incentives is. And when governments make those decisions, are they being led by the right evidence, the right kind of logic and theory and economic history? Or are they just being overwhelmed by the more showy political implications of resource allocation?
Chris, can I say something on the previous slide?
Please do, yeah. If I can get back. There we go.
It's on this last point. I think there is, apart from the theoretical Kaldor, Kaletsky type arguments about the role of the manufacturing sector and investment goods and so on, this last bullet point about political economy really is often underestimated. If you think of most countries, people make jokes about the stupidity of rural people. Rural life is always regarded as backward, as slow to change, as tradition bound, whereas modernity, prestige and technological sophistication is associated with non-agricultural factors, non-agricultural world. This is a huge cultural enduring since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and debates between the city and the country, which were the early work of the cultural theorist Raymond Williams, who would have been 100 this week, I remember reading. Okay.
Yeah, people in England still sort of invoke a particular accent to conjure up the idea of slightly thick-headed rural farming communities and so on. It's an enduring trope. You're quite right. So let's slow down a little bit. So we've got this idea of industrial policy and what it might be for, but we're still kind of not quite going to the heart of this matter of what we mean by the industrial. What's going on in these stories that we've been telling is an idea of classification analytically. Right? So we talk about something special about the manufacturing sector, about industry and industrial policy. Well, what that implies is that there are very obvious differences between what counts as industrial manufacturing output and what counts as something else, agriculture, primary sector activities, secondary sector activities, tertiary, like services and so on. This is just one example of something that we all do, we all use on a daily basis, and we do in our work, intellectual work. We need it as social scientists, for example. We need to work with classification systems. The existing world is too wild, it's too continuous, and we need to impose these sort of usually artificial breaks on a continuous reality. We need to put things in baskets that we call classes or categories, and we define boundaries around them, why this basket is different from that basket. Michel Foucault almost sort of made his name with his first book called The Order of Things, and he talked about historically the way in which we all need to use classification to, as he put it, to tame the wild profusion of existing things. Often
faced with these problems of the wild profusion and the need to, we say, oh, let's go to an authority. And the authority typically for development economists is some UN system. So in the case of industry, one would go and see how the United Nations Industrial Development Organization defines the industrial sector. Well, if you look at it closely, they're often very confused about what's a mine and what's a manufacturing, mining, processing sector. They can't draw the boundaries around the industrial sector very precisely, and they shift, they change. Sometimes mines are included in some countries, some sort of mines are included as industries, others are in the mining sector. The decision as to which sector things go into can't really be left to a committee of the UN or the UN UNIDO or FAO. Okay, that's right.
Yeah, no, quite right. And I mean, so there are shifts, there are revisions to the standard international trade classification system, for example. But I think what we're going to go on and say is we don't think those capture enough of the change that's going on in agriculture. So what matters actually to do our work properly, all of you to do your work properly, is rather than always just taking as biblical or Quranic truth the authorities that John refers to, is always to question these necessarily imperfect classification systems. And what we need a good classification system to do, however imperfect it may be, is we need it to be useful. We need it to reveal something, to help us learn about reality, rather than to hide, obscure, and cover in kind of misunderstanding the reality we're trying to make sense of. So always think about, well, have the boundaries shifted between categories? Is this the right way of making a distinction? Are there ways in which not changing a categorical system is somehow politically useful? And what do we miss by unthinkingly accepting classifications? All of you can probably think yourself of different classification systems or categories in economics. One of the ones that John and I have often, if you look at the book we keep plugging and that you've all been given the link to the open access version of this week, I think. One of the things we go on and on about is the category of the female-headed household in rural African societies, and how that often leads to a misinterpretation of social and economic realities in the countryside. I mean, you can think of all sorts of different ones at very, very big levels. You will read things that talk about the global south or the global north. How clear are you whether that's really the best way of interpreting distribution of resources and power and relationships in the global economy, and so on and so forth? So we need to think quite in quite a sustained way, when whatever we do, about these categorical systems underpinning this. And that's what's at the heart of our thinking about agriculture and industrial policy. So more simply, economists have always tended to work with a fairly simple three-sector idea of the economy. You've got primary, secondary, tertiary activities. So we've got agricultural, manufacturing, industry, and services activities. Often that owes a particular debt to the work of a kind of pioneering statistician and economist, Colin Clark, but it's something inherited by all economists. It shapes the way we think, and that John and I have already been talking about the process of economic development and structural change. When you read Danny Roderick, or earlier than him, in fact, coining the phrase was Gabriel Palmer, when you read about this idea of premature deindustrialization, they are invoking a classification system that's unchanging. This whole idea, its prominence in our minds as economists, is one of the reasons why people get Arthur Lewis on the process of structural change wrong, where he was talking mainly about the shift from non-capitalist to capitalist, from low productivity to high productivity activities. He's always interpreted as thinking about a shift out of agriculture into manufacturing industry. Now, it's something arguably that particularly characterizes the work of non-neoclassical economists. That's because neoclassical economists tend to be a little less bothered by these sectoral differences. They think that everything, all economic activities, equally are characterized by diminishing returns, and really you just need the market to allocate resources, and you don't have to think too much about particular sectoral incentives or structure. But structurally, yeah, go on.
I mean, the essence of a neoclassical economist desire to ignore industrial policy or the implications of structural change in the growth process is that they believe that if prices are right, if markets more or less work, it really doesn't matter what sector you're in. Agents will make choices, and their choices will lead to efficient, optimal growth trajectories. You don't need to single out or choose for them a particular sector that you intervene to support.
Okay, John, do you want to go?
Can I just?
Yeah,
I just want to go back a little bit, which is on just to say something a little bit more about, make a stupid joke about the transport sector. People often refer to make divisions of various kinds between sectors, and often the divisions they make are singularly unhelpful. I'm reminded of a very, very poor person who spends their life head loading over long distances, carrying things on their heads on a casual basis for people who pay them to carry stuff to market on their heads. They are self-employed in the transport sector. So is a guy who owns several dozen huge lorries and hires them out. He's also a self-employed entrepreneur in the transport sector. Are they really in the same sector? Are they doing the same sort of thing? This points to the need to look at with greater granularity at the actual activity rather than some arbitrary, oh, they're both in the transport sector. Clearly, in a sense they are, but clearly in important senses, they're not doing the same sort of things. Okay.
Yeah. And that granularity is exactly what we're going to delve into in a little bit. And before we do, just one more thing is, structuralist development economists. John already talked about Prebisch and Singer and this idea of the secular decline in the net barter terms of trade for primary commodities vis-a-vis manufactured goods. But those arguments, which have underpinned so much pessimism about commodity exports and undermined investment in a lot of agriculture and so on, themselves rest on very simplistic and clear categorical ideas about commodities and what they are. And often those arguments slightly exclude a number of things which are commodities, but seem to have behaved in rather different ways in terms of relative prices, like, for example, lithium now, or rare earth minerals in their distribution. Anything you want to add on that, John, before we move on?
Yes, I mean, if you look at sort of over the years at sort of various UNCTAD trade and development reviews, annual reviews, very often they present data on the terms of trade facing Africa, African exporters, in two columns. They say that they look at the terms of trade for primary commodity exports, excluding oil. In other words, they make a decision about what constitutes a real primary commodity and what isn't a primary commodity. If you include a variety of different things in your definition of a primary commodity, some of them have price trends which are very, very different from others. And we've given some examples on the slide: lithium, cobalt, rare earth minerals, and so on. So where you draw the boundaries around primary commodity exports will give you a very different result on your views about the terms of trade facing primary commodity exporters.
Good. So let's get granular and let's think a little bit more about what we understand by the industrial in this classification that we all do. And when you start to ask, what does it mean for something to be industrial or not, you begin to find that actually that's a bit slippery as a category itself. That historically there's been lots of different ways of trying to capture what's important about the industrial, whether that's Adam Smith, but he's writing really before the industrial revolution's getting properly underway. So you get a very different idea when you read Marx, and Marx is emphasizing particular facets of what might be industrial. He's more interested in machines and the relationship between human beings and machinery, because technology had changed so much and the machine industry was developing so dramatically. But he's also interested in something about the scale of production and puts his emphasis more on sort of urban factories and so on. But he's not the be all and the end all of thinking about what it means to be industrial. And when you look at a particular work in the late 1920s by the economist Alan Young, you find another thing that we've found really, really interesting and helpful in our thinking and observation about this. For Alan Young, what it means for something to be industrial is that it involves this thing that he calls an intricate nexus being inserted between the origins of a commodity and the final consumer product. He sees that what's going on in that is what he calls a roundabout production. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean and what its implications are. So he says, look, there's this intricate nexus inserted between the beginnings of a commodity and final consumption good. And that is a function of what he calls capitalistic and roundabout production. And it happens through a very Adam Smith type interplay of the size of the market and the division of labor, the specialization that gives rise to. And you get these what other economists, somebody like, I think Alfred Marshall, called intimate connections between different activities. And for Alan Young, that is where you find the economies that are revealed in increasing returns. And that is the process that is industrial, this roundabout production. It's not just somebody sort of going outside with a watering can and pouring the water on the plant and waiting for it to produce some berries or apples or fruit and then picking them or whatever. It's much more roundabout and complex than that. One of the implications of Alan Young's work that long ago, 1928, this was published, was that actually some of the differences between sectors, they get increasingly blurred by these interdependencies between different economic activities. And the focus, the thing we need to think about much more closely is economic activities and their interaction, rather than getting stuck on these overly distinguished and large ideas of sectors, which may hide quite a lot of the important economic reality that we need to think about. So out of that way of thinking about what's industrial and what's significant about that, we come up with slightly new questions. We start to observe trends in a different way, and we start to see that maybe some of the boundaries between activities and sectors have been shifting. There's one quite well-known example of this in the general economic literature about the global economy. And that's this idea, it's a horrible word, but it's an interesting idea, which is servicification. Sometimes I can't even say it. And what servicification means is it's the rising share in the final value of a produced good that actually is accounted for by service sector activities like design or logistics or branding. So think of the share in the final value for Apple of an iPhone or something like that. How much that value really is of service sector activity. It becomes really hard to pull apart. Well, it's an iPhone, it's a thing, it's a produced, manufactured, industrial. Actually, this is a Samsung, but never mind. Same thing going on. But it combines the manufacturing with the service sector activity. And what we've begun to see is that there's something a little bit related going on elsewhere in the economy, which is a blurring between agriculture and manufacturing industry, and also, in fact, between agriculture and services too. And that's the roots of this thing that we're going to talk about, that we call the industrialization of freshness, which will...
Can we go back, Chris?
Yes.
To the previous slide?
Yep, go on.
I just want to, I also can't say it, servicification. I just want to say that this is, people begin to talk about it because it's empirically hard to avoid. If one looks at the growth of different types of trade between countries, the proportion of total trade that takes the form of trade in services has been rising really dramatically. And that's one interpretation of servicification, that the proportion of trade, the value of trade that is accounted for by, in quotes, services, whatever they mean, has been rising and is now very, very large. So you have to say something about that. What has growth of capitalist economies, the growth of world trade, got to do with an increasing share of servicification in total value added?
Okay. But too many people, especially when we think about agriculture, don't notice this, or don't think through sufficiently the implications of this. And what they work with is this persistent, old idea, but we think increasingly misleading idea about agriculture. And that view has its roots in, for example, Adam Smith saying that the nature of agriculture does not admit of so many subdivisions of labor, nor of so complete a separation of one business from another as manufactures. You could go rather a lot later into the 20th century, and a fantastic development economist, Albert Hirschman, who earlier on thought something similar. He said, look, when we think about linkages, forward and backward and other linkages between economic activities, there are fewer of them in agriculture than there are in manufacturing industry. He came over time to shift that view, but earlier on had quite a clear idea of this. So this idea bleeds into contemporary development economics. You can read Gala and others, they're associated with the Harvard complexity lot, and they argue that specializing in agriculture and extractive industries does not enable technological evolution. That, if you are a Brazilian, for example, and you know anything about kind of biotechnology or let alone coffee or sugar or something more traditional like that, is a staggering misapprehension about agriculture. It's really phenomenal. Or you get a very influential development economist, I think once upon a time the chief economist of what used to be DFID in the UK, arguing that processed primary exports, okay, processed ones, more agro-industrial, are clearly more skill intensive than unprocessed primary exports. I suspect many of you, fairly reasonably perhaps, would agree with that. But it's something we're hoping to challenge very, very quickly now. And we think that that enduring view badly misrepresents, ignores things that have changed in global agriculture. John was talking about the rise in trade in services. We all know about the rising share also of trade in intermediate goods that's at the heart of global value chains, GVCs, and the way those have come to be an incredibly important way in which economies are integrated, globalized, and world trade and production is conducted. But what many people don't seem to appreciate is that since, particularly around the mid-1990s, there's been a dramatic, rapid growth of specifically agricultural global value chains as well. And it's not something that's necessarily captured in the Gala, the complexity literature, in Adrian Wood, or so on. Anything you want to add for now, John?
No, that's fine.
So let's go on from there. And our main point from here on is that there's, to go back to what Nicolas said earlier on, saying, well, John and Chris, they're interested in agricultural activities inspired by industrial activities. We want to be a bit clearer than that. What we're talking about is not what people classically think of as agro-industry or agro-processing. It's not the machinery in Mozambique that removes the shell and the skin of a cashew nut in order to turn that into a shelled cashew nut that can be exported, so on and so forth. It's not that. It's not milling and hulling and so on and so forth. It's this set of activities that we think are not inspired by industry. They are industrial, and they show up in this process of the industrialization of freshness. Let's start with a few small examples internationally. You could think about the way in which agriculture increasingly globally uses this combination of remote satellite, incredible, if you think about complexity as the embodiment of technology and knowledge, very, very highly sophisticated remote satellite equipment and technology with in situ, on-field sensors to generate a kind of accurate, detailed level of rates of crop growth and health that farmers just didn't have before with the same degree of accuracy and regularity. And that influences the way in which they apply fertilizers and water and so on and so forth. I came across once an extraordinary example of this, which is that you all presumably, or many of you know what I mean by Anfield. It's from this dreadful football club called Liverpool, wonderful football club, sadly. And I went on a site visit. I did a form of field work, which is I went on a tour of the Liverpool football stadium of Anfield a while back. And I saw these strange sensors, these strange little machines at the edges of the football pitch. And I was asking the groundsman about them. And what they are is they are these electronic sensors that monitor in minute detail the health, the rate of growth, the angle leaning of the grass, of every blade of grass. And that data from those sensors is relayed constantly to a firm in the Netherlands, an agricultural multinational firm in the Netherlands, which monitors the data and then analyzes that data and sends back on the basis of that data recommendations to the groundsman for how much water this end of the pitch should get, how much water the other end of the pitch should get, what light should be shone on it at night, and so on and so forth. So in a way, Liverpool Football Club has been integrated into a Dutch-led agricultural global value chain, and a highly technically sophisticated one. There's one example. Another example is that you may not know, or you may not even care, but it's very interesting that every single calf born to a cow in Uruguay, the moment it's born, has a little microchip inserted behind its ear. Every single one. It meant that Uruguay, for whom the cattle industry is very, very important, became the first country where 100% of the cattle stock could be monitored, ranging over large areas of land, so monitored for its health, its nutrition, not just its whereabouts. And those microchips, a lot of the technology has been developed within Uruguay itself. Similarly, there's things like apps and software, like I think a company called Suck Plant, which uses algorithms, sensors, AI, big data, cloud-based technology to work out how much stress avocado trees are in South Africa and elsewhere, what levels of water there is in each plant, what in a particular site where there's avocado trees growing, what is the forecast for the climate, and on the basis of that generates precise irrigation needs, which affects wastage of water and chemicals, but it also affects yields and so on. The last example for now is about cherries, and I partly like this example because, again, people think that agriculture is not complex. It's relatively easy and simple. And there's this cherry grower in Chile, Hernán Garcés, who argued, I began to do cherries precisely because it was difficult. And his fruit company is the world's largest producer of cherries now. Its output's increased 25-fold in 15 years. Well, how's that possible? Is it just by lots of low productivity labor wandering around the fields constantly talking nicely to the cherry trees? No, they use these enormous fans to warm the trees in winter. They use helicopters to fan dry the fruit if there's a downpour of rain. And they use these very, very innovative bags to regulate the air in the packaging. And they used to be imported from the USA, but now they've substituted that with the technology and they produce them locally. So this is, again, very much about linkages from agriculture to manufacturing. But it would be very difficult not to characterize all the examples I've just given you as very roundabout in Alan Young's phrasing. It's roundabout capitalistic production. It is the insertion of an increasingly intricate nexus between planting a cherry tree and the fresh. It doesn't look like a processed cherry when it's on the shelves in a punnet when a sort of grouchy bourgeois consumer like me goes into my local supermarket. It's a fresh cherry. But there's this extraordinarily intricacy and roundaboutness that has generated that particularly delicious cherry that I'm going to probably pay too much for, or maybe not enough. Do you want to talk about this example, John?
No, you go ahead.
Shall I go ahead? Okay.
Yeah.
We want to run through some more examples just to kind of emphasize this point about the intricate nexus, the roundabout production, the industrialization of freshness. People through markets in the Netherlands, for example, will buy little cuttings of pelargonium plants. And it may well be, as in the case here, that these are produced, the tiny little cuttings, not in the Netherlands under greenhouses there, but in rural Ethiopia. And if you go to is it a factory? Is it a farm? A production site that generates these things? You see all sorts of technical activity. Some of it looks fairly simple. The yellow strips that are there to attract and trap insects, for example. You can see dangling bottom left a spray can, a sprayer. But more than that, if you look at the fretwork, a network of rods and pillars along there, and you look at the ceiling above, you will see that other things are going on. You might think, well, Christopher Cramer is a rather bad photographer. It's all a bit sort of vague and misty in the distance where those women are working. Actually, that's mist. So there is a regulation of the moisture content in the air. And there's also something else going on, which is the regulation of light. And when the owner, the Dutch owner of this place was talking us through the activities and the organization of production, and he talked about the way in which they regulate the light. I said, well, look, do you mean that you're sleep depriving these plants? And he said, yeah. He says, no, we're torturing the plants, if you like. This is very, very roundabout. This isn't just waiting for something to grow under the right conditions. Even the water, there's something that they use there and in many farms, and it's called reverse osmosis. And for the life of me, I can't now remember, John, what actually reverse osmosis is, but it's about cleaning out, I think, filtering out impurities in the water. And that requires very expensive machinery and sophisticated knowledge for how to use that in particular conditions. So there's that example. Do you want to take on another one, if I can? Yeah, do you want to go there?
It's I suppose it's part of a continuation of what you were saying, that these are the most highly skilled workers on this particular, and it's the most desirable job, and involves the sort of final packaging prior to going preparation for air freighting. And it's hard to see that this is any different from a factory assembly line. If you go into an assembly line for sports shoe manufacture or t-shirts, it doesn't look that different from the sort of lines where people are assembling these final bouquets and wrapping them.
So in our really, really bad joke, we say that, you often think about assembly plants for t-shirts and iPhones and so on and so forth, but this is plant assembly. It's the other way around, but it's the same process going on in terms of the division of labor and so on. And just to kind of bang on the theme about capitalistic and roundabout production, the two examples in this slide, in your top left, you have a very literal form of roundabout production and the division of labor in an Ethiopian herb producing and exporting firm on the outskirts of Debrecen, which is sort of southeast from Addis Ababa. And you'll see that, you should see a round table in the background and a cable rising on the wall behind that. And that table rotates, and there are these women on different parts of the table doing highly specialized specific roles within, so there's that clear division of labor and round table production, if you like. That's a rather simple part of the process, but in that same room where those ladies are, you will also find that there's two different kinds of technically very, very advanced cold storage machinery and so on, something we'll come back to in a minute when we talk about further linkages. But on the bottom right, you'll see something that goes in two directions. Okay, it's a very obvious thing, and it shows the complexity of machinery used and the instructions for managing it in a juicer. So this is also in Ethiopia, and this is a firm that was aiming to be at one stage, it's got South African investment in it, by the way, as well, amongst other investors. It was aiming to be the largest passion fruit producer and exporter in the world. And it also produces mangoes and so on and so forth. And it has juicing extraction and machinery on site. And one of the things actually that comes from this is what we found by talking to farm managers and owners there was that, all right, the machinery looks quite sophisticated. And of course it is. It embodies a lot of knowledge and research and technology. But in a funny way, it's relatively easy to operate, which is a theme we're going to kind of extend in a second. But what was really, really difficult and required a lot of tacit knowledge, not quite in the textbooks, if you like, was how to generate a reliable, consistent flow, output of high quality passion fruit or mangoes or whatever in the first place. And if you don't have that, it doesn't matter how much you spend on your equipment all the way from Parma in northern Italy to pulp and juice your fruits if you don't have good enough throughput. So the complexity actually often lies in the field. Just to harp on this theme of the blurring of sectoral boundaries, one of the people we talked to managing a flower farm in Ethiopia again said to us, look, I used to think that we had a simple job. We were selling flowers, and there was peak demand around, for example, Christmas or Valentine's Day, so on and so forth. But he realized increasingly with the merger of floriculture, growing flowers, and industrial activities and the technology of the reverse osmosis, the management of all sorts of technical aspects, the monitoring, all of these things, in order to get into markets, for example, in the EU, you have to meet very, very stringent phytosanitary and sanitary regulations. And that itself has implications for the technology that's embodied in the production of these things, because you have to be able to trace every flower, every avocado, every cherry, whatever it is, back, not just to the country where it came from, but to the specific farm, possibly even the specific field and the date it was produced and handled. So you've got to have very sophisticated monitoring and barcoding technology to do that gets incorporated into that intricate nexus. And so he said, look, combining all of that with the branding and the idea of Valentine's Day and so on and so forth, he said, actually, we're not really an agricultural output firm. I realize that our product is emotion. We are selling emotion, and that emotion blends the agriculture, the primary, the technology, the so-called secondary, and the branding and so on, i.e. the tertiary sector, all completely in one product like that. John, why don't you talk to us about South African oranges?
Good. We've shown a similar slide to lots of audiences, and we try to do a rather silly trick. We ask them, look at the big orange on the right and the beautifully packaged series container of juice on the left, and say, which is the more complex, which is the more processed, which is the more sophisticated technological product? And people usually say, well, obviously it's the juice, that you've had to do all that sort of stuff. You've had to process. The other thing is just a basic primary commodity. We suggest you have to think about this, because the sort of thing that goes into the juice are the second-rate oranges, are the oranges that have got blemishes, defects that wouldn't look good on a supermarket shelf. It's a cheap process, and you don't have to worry too much about quality control. Juicing is something sort of anyone can do, but to produce a perfect round orange that will survive shipment, and the quality of South African ports means shipment is quite a problem of oranges. To produce a fresh orange that will be ripe, more or less, when people buy it off a supermarket shelf, and to package it correctly so that its degree of ripeness is precisely appropriate, so that in X days from now, it will be ready for the supermarket shelf. That is really technologically complex. That's difficult. It's really hard. You have to meet types of phytosanitary regulations that are extremely demanding. That is difficult. That is technologically extraordinarily sophisticated. Go to the next slide now.
Yeah.
This,
more to the slide.
Yeah. Why don't you take over, Chris?
You want to see it all? Okay. So again, this happens all over the world, but our research took us to blueberry producers in in South Africa again. And if you think of a blueberry, you got to think, well, what is it? What actually is a blueberry? Is it a primary commodity? And if it's produced at scale, perhaps we're dealing with a big farmer, a highly capitalized farm producing this agricultural fruit, this little berry. Or is it actually, in some senses, a manufactured good, precisely because of the industrialization of freshness, the genetic plant stock science that goes on in, above all, I think, in California. So if you're a producer of blueberries for export in South Africa, you may need to send somebody to California, and you've got to get some, you've got to do trials to work out, well, which specific variety is going to work in the very particular agroclimatic conditions where my farm is. So we've already, before we've planted anything, we're dealing with incredibly sophisticated R&D activities going on largely in the private sector here in California and elsewhere. But then we've got to add the monitoring, the traceability, all that oversight, the barcoding, the drip feeding irrigation. We've got to think about the packaging of the blueberries. We don't want, if we have a punnet of blueberries, we don't want it going all soggy or getting bruised easily and so on. So how can we use cardboard or whatever packages that don't cost too much, but that do the job that we need, that let the fruit breathe, they don't let it over ripen. With some things, I'm not sure it happens with blueberries. With avocados, for example, even after export, this process of industrialization of freshness carries on, because when the avocados from South Africa arrive in the UK on their way to me, they're not ripe. So they go to a ripening facility where particular gases, ripening gases, are applied to try and achieve that thing where I arrive at my grocery store or the supermarket, and I pick up an avocado and it's got this label on it that says ripe and ready to eat. And about 5 years ago, it wasn't. It said ripe and ready to eat, but it was like a kind of rock that I would be expected to eat. Nowadays, a very high proportion of them really are. So the technology's got better. Sorry, we went to avocados, back to the blueberries. So is it a primary commodity? Is it a secondary sector activity, a manufactured good? Or is it a services activity? Is it not a big pharma, but it's big pharma? So this particular owner that we were interviewing, of a South African blueberry exporter, he had a punnet of blueberries, his product, on the table between him and John and me. And he took one up and rolled it between his fingers. And he said, this is a pill. Okay, it's big pharma. What he meant was a huge amount of why he was investing in that business, of the profitability of that business, was because of the service sector branding idea of blueberries as a health product, as a superfood that's particularly good because of its antioxidants for your health. So you tell us, what the hell is a blueberry? How do we categorically distinguish a blueberry from a manufactured good, an industrial output, or from a pharmaceutical service sector activity?
This equation, if you go back, Chris, this equation of the blueberry with the pill, it's a little bit like the slide which showed that what a flower producer was producing was love. In other words, the effort, the branding effort, and the subsidization of researchers and the sponsored magazine articles which show how good blueberries are for your health is an intrinsic part of the business, absolutely central. And it's not clear that the actual production of blueberries is anything like as important as the branding and the packaging and the very, very complex packaging research that goes into a successful blueberry export business.
Yeah. And when we think about these activities we've been talking about, and John was just talking about specifically within the blueberry farm, or what he was talking about earlier, the orange farmers in South Africa who used this technical phrase about it's only I think the technical phrase was only the crap oranges that go into the cartons, and the cartons are simple technology, not producing the really beautiful round, ripe, tasty, juicy oranges. We've been talking about this kind of within the firm, if you like, but what's really important to emphasize for a moment is the way in which linkages spread from these activities through the rest of the economy. And
before you go on, Chris,
yeah,
to situate this slide, this discussion, remember earlier on, Chris said that it was the view that as compared to factories or manufacturing enterprises, agricultural enterprises had fewer linkages. One of the reasons why you might give less priority to investment in agricultural enterprises is that their linkage, their spread effects were much smaller than factories, manufacturing enterprises. So it's important that we look with some insight, carefully, and with some skepticism at this, and ask exactly how might linkages play out in an agricultural activity. And that's what Chris is going to do in this slide.
So one example of how they played out is through the floriculture industry in Ethiopia. The expansion of which is, many people talk about it. It hasn't been as successful as in some countries like Colombia or whatever, but it did, at least for a while, represent a very, very rapid rate of increase from zero, virtually. And that owed a lot to the specific intervention of the late then Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who helped do deals with the Dutch and bring the Dutch state in to back Dutch private sectors. And there were a lot of flower growers that came also from Kenya into Ethiopia, and there were Ethiopian floriculture capitalists as well. But what's really important about, and it began not just with pelargoniums or poinsettias, but simply with roses, with cut roses for export. And if you want to succeed in exporting cut roses to the Middle East from Ethiopia, or to the EU market from Ethiopia, it's like that Japanese industrial concept of just in time. You have what Hirschman called a very, very narrow margin for failure. You have to get this right. What that means is, from the moment you snip the roses and they go through that sorting room that we showed you earlier, that John talked about, they have to be kept at very particular temperatures, and they have to be sped to the airport. They have to get to the airport very, very fast. And then they have to be held in a cold storage facility there until the plane is ready to, the freight plane is ready to carry them to Rotterdam or wherever it may be. So Ethiopia didn't necessarily have the capability to sustain a successful large floriculture export business like that, until it decided that in order to bet on this, to bet on the floriculture sector, it had to get the state-owned airline, Ethiopian Airlines, to develop that capability. And they did. So Ethiopian Airlines invested very heavily, in fact, in building, developing much better and bigger freight capabilities and cold storage facilities at the airport of Bole International Airport on the edge of Addis Ababa. So there's a forward linkage, if you like, from the roses to the transport facility investment. And then once you've got that improved capability at the airport, there's a new backward linkage to the spread from roses to other forms of floriculture, but also to kind of fruit exports and so on as well. So there are forward and backward linkages operating here. But then within the airport and the airline, Ethiopian Airlines, that was one part of the process, the expanding freight hub of Ethiopian Airlines and the airport there, began to kind of generate economies of scope as well as of scale, and made it easier to build on that success and to create a big international training center at the airport where they train crews and other airline staff from around the continent, and in fact beyond the African continent as well. So the linkages go in from the agriculture to the services to the manufacturing, all sorts of directions. There was in fact then later a really, I mean, nobody could have foreseen it as a completely unexpected linkage to what we've all been experiencing in the last year and a half or so, the COVID-19 pandemic. Early on in the pandemic, what happened to international flight and trade threatened to sink Ethiopian Airlines. It was the biggest airline in Africa. It was one of the very few profitable airlines globally, and a state-owned one, as we keep insisting. And the government said to it, look, all right, we may own you, but we can't bail you out. We can't afford to do this. Well, what did they do? Drawing on their experience and capabilities in floriculture and the broader freight, expanding freight services and capabilities at the airport, Ethiopian Airlines very dramatically converted the majority of its passenger airlines into freight planes. And it came to play a very, very important role in the global movement and transport of PPE, protective equipment, and of vaccines and so on. Not just to Africa or to Ethiopia, but for example, from East Asia to Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really important to think through these linkages. As John said, in the context of what many people argue, which is that, well, really, there's very limited scope for linkages in agriculture. We think that's very misleading and in some senses quite profoundly wrong. So,
before you go away, on the previous slide.
Previous slide. Yeah. The flowers. There we go.
No, yeah, this linkages.
Yeah.
It is Hirschman, who really we owe the concept of linkages, or the best discussion of linkages in the process of economic development, identified another linkage that's sort of not often talked about, which is fiscal linkage. And it sounds a bit sort of strange, from cut roses to changes in the fiscal system, but in an odd way, we were beginning to see this at Addis Ababa airport as a result of the growth of the need for cold storage, cut flowers, and then herbs and vegetables for air transport. They invested massively in cold storage and logistics facilities at the airport, and then it became clear that one of the constraints to achieving just-in-time process of export was customs clearance. There was a cumbersome, handwritten system of customs clearance and export tax duties and so on. But there was pressure, political pressure, because they'd spent so much money on these logistics, cold storage systems, very, very fancy stuff, to update and computerize the whole of the Ethiopian government's customs clearance system. So there was if you like, a fiscal, administrative, state capacity linkage associated with, or at the end of a chain of linkages from the initial export of the cut roses. Mm-hmm. One more thing, I think you'll see in the development economics literature very often a discussion often associated with extractive industries, or more generally primary commodities. And it said that producing primary commodities for export in Africa and in other relatively poor economies involves an enclave. Involves a little island of modernity, a little island of high productivity activity, surrounded by a sea where nothing else changes. It's an enclave. It doesn't have any influence on the surrounding production system, productivity activities. I think if you begin to think about what we've been saying about the Ethiopian floriculture and high-value horticultural export industries, you can begin to see how, with a bit of imagination and a small amount of research, you can destroy these myths about enclave production. Actually, linkages are quite subtle, quite complex, and certainly exist in many, if you like, unlikely areas of primary commodity export production.
Yeah, that's really important. We could talk for ages about that. One of the main towns where this flower industry grew up in Ethiopia, on the edges of the town, is a place called Ziway in Ethiopia, where the point where we were first doing research on this, so it's more than this now, and that was what, about 10 years ago or so. There was something like 10,000 people employed in the flower sector there. And the part of the linkages from that were spillovers through employment. They were consumption linkages that led to a rapid expansion in construction activities, in bars and security related services. On the edge of town, the production of high value onions and peppers and so on and so forth. And there were broader spread effects back into the countryside, because most of the people employed in these flower farms were very poor women who had run away from or escaped from even more indigent existences in the deep countryside, and they were remitting to them and so on and so forth. So the linkage activity is really important. The other side of what I've been talking about, and John was just talking about with the fiscal linkages, is the state's very important in all of this. And there's one more aspect of the state in the flower story in Ethiopia worth talking about, which is, you know, how do you get to succeed in this business? And when we were at the airport looking at the cold storage facilities, we began to notice that there were soldiers milling around, and we thought, well, look, you know, are they just hoping to get some roses for their girlfriends or whatever it might be? And we started asking about why there were these armed soldiers milling around the cold storage facilities. And it turned out that every lorry, every truck that leaves a flower farm headed for the airport and the cold storage facilities and the freight service to the Netherlands or wherever, every truckload is accompanied by an armed guard provided by the state. So you've got to think about another form of linkages there, or the significance, the role of the state in underpinning the conditions of successful capitalist accumulation. I think perhaps I won't get into talking about what's been happening in KwaZulu-Natal recently, but it's an issue worth thinking about in why it can be quite difficult to succeed in these businesses. But to sum up for now, before we move on to the policy implications of all of this, that's where we are. Well, I think we've showed you something about, through some examples, about what we understand by the industrialization of freshness, why it's significant, as John says, in terms of the plenitude of linkages involved, the sophistication and roundaboutness of production, the embodied complex technology and knowledge and so on. And I think we would argue that in producing pelargoniums, poinsettias, avocados, citrus fruits in South Africa, whatever it might be, this is no less complex than an industrial park where people are stitching together gloves for Warren Buffett, for Costco, or assembling t-shirts, so on and so forth. And if that's the case, what then are the implications for policy? What are the criteria that we need to use to try and influence investment and economic activity. Do we
Before
just...
we go on,
Yeah, go on.
can
Do we just stick with the idea of agriculture and industry or manufacturing, or do we do something else? John?
Yeah, I just want to, before we pursue other policy implications of what we're saying, I just want to go back to Ziwe, this town where there's been phenomenal growth of wage labor. And Chris was describing all of the associated linkages, because there were lots of people who got wage employment on these effectively state-sponsored, initially, rose farms. The implication was that there were lots more jobs for people who were hairdressers, because people had wages, and people who were selling motorcycle taxi rides, because people had wages and could employ them, or people who were doing little bits of building repair and selling burglar alarms to protect the new items of furniture that people could afford to buy. The implication of this is, to my mind, something that's not often said, but should be said, that the best conditions for the growth of small enterprises, hairdressers, beauty parlors, small builders, furniture makers, the best conditions are if there's a fast rate of growth of wage employment. So if you want to have a fast rate of growth of small enterprises doing the hairdressing and the sewing and the small motorcycle taxi, make sure you've got a fast rate of growth of wage employment. It's a more efficient and more likely to succeed form of intervention than microcredit for small enterprises. The constraint on these small enterprises, previous constraint, was not the absence of microcredit. The constraint on the expansion of these enterprises was demand for their products. And you can achieve that through achieving a reasonable rate of growth of wage employment. So that's a roundabout way of getting to a policy implication that we push quite seriously in our book.
Yeah. Okay, so what I hope that we've shown between us is that there's something very real going on here. But more than that, it's not just that we're a couple of sort of slightly nerdy eggheads following some sort of, I don't know, kind of Google hole on these technical things. This is really important. It's really significant. And because it's really significant, it raises very, very important policy implications. And that's where we want to kind of bring this towards a close before opening up for some discussion, is to talk a little bit more about the policy angle on all of this. Do you want to start, John, or shall
I? Well, the most influential view in development economics is from the Harvard group. Hausman, I suppose, is the name that's most familiar to many people, who define sort of different types of trade in terms of the complexity of the goods traded. Again, it's a classification issue. Which goods are classified as complex and which goods are not classified as complex? And we argue it's far too simplistic. It's misleading. And it usually ends up with the policy conclusion that if you're a country at the moment producing goods that are not very complex, like primary commodities, you better stick to them, because it's only when you get to a much higher level of skilled labor force and so on that you could afford to ignore your comparative advantage and really try to produce complex goods. In other words, it's the same old story about comparative advantage, but couched in a new language. So we think that the complexity analysis, the categories of complexity produced by this group seems to be incapable of understanding how technologically sophisticated much of the activities in, for example, the Brazilian agricultural sector are. We pose the question, how do we know which is the more complex, which is the more sophisticated? The production of that perfect orange or simple textile assembly in South Africa? How do we know? On what basis can we conclude that the textile assembly is the more complex activity? In choosing between activities that should be our focus, what are our criteria for saying we want to focus on this activity? We want to devote a lot of R&D expenditure, state support of different kinds, protection, allocation of skilled manpower or skilled personnel to a particular activity rather than another. How do we prioritize? Do we say, well, let's choose those activities where there's a large scope for productivity increases, where there's a great deal of scope for employment growth, especially in the sectors of the labor market that have the greatest difficulty in obtaining employment at a decent wage? Do we choose those sectors that could prevent the economy from stalling because of a balance of payments crisis? In other words, we choose those sectors that can make a really important contribution to the rate of growth of export revenue, because we know that in many poor economies, a period of reasonable output expansion is brought to a rapid halt because the rate of growth of imports is too fast and can't be covered by export revenue. So do we want to avoid the sort of the stalling, the up and down? Do we want to achieve a sustained rate of growth of output by achieving a reasonable rate of growth of export revenue? So we look at our activities by saying, well, what contribution do they make to the balance of payments? So to repeat, is our main criterion expansion of employment, balance of payments contribution, scope for productivity, that this is a sector in which productivity is rather low, but there is enormous scope for quite rapid and sustained increases in productivity. What are the criteria that should determine our policy choices?
So let's look for one example at the sorts of answer to that question in an interesting country. What sort of priorities were made in Chile? And Chile is a country which is often seen as the sort of poster child for laissez-faire, so-called neoliberal policies. It's also an economy in which new, not copper, but new and largely agricultural and forestry-related resource-based exports reached nearly 30% of exports by 2017. There was quite a rapid increase over 2-3 decades in these new primary resource-based exports. Was this because of that famed neoliberalism in Chile or not? Well, when we look a bit more closely, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. It wasn't just because the state got out of the way and left markets entirely to themselves and deregulated everything. No, the state seems to have been very, very important. All sorts of organizational things going on underpinning that success. It wasn't just waiting for comparative advantage to work its magic. Something had to happen. So there were very important public-private institutional linkages. For example, the Fundación Chile that created display firms as a sort of demonstration effect. There were really important state-managed technology transfer programs in the salmon export business for agricultural engineers particularly, and in the fruit with Japan, but with California for the berries and the fruit sector. So there's these technology transfer programs managed by the state. There was also really important, we always emphasize this, public R&D, not just the R&D of individual private sector firms, but public agricultural R&D, helping to generate very, very interesting increasing rate of patents registered for salmon vaccines, for methods of biotesting. There was that the public R&D was behind the improvement in the efficiency and effectiveness of quality control labs in these industries and so on. And in a similar sector, there's the wine, but I'm not talking about the wine today, but there's also the forestry sector. It had been noted that a particular kind of tree, the Pina radiata, very, very important in the timber industry, grew particularly rapidly in certain parts of Chile. So the state intervened by providing very heavily subsidized loans, 75% or even higher later on, to encourage people, to push investors, private sector investors, to invest in planting on a large scale these trees, and combining that with state-supported forestry R&D. So far from this fantasy of the neoliberal ideal in Chile, a very, very important successful part of the Chilean economy has specifically been underpinned by very, very clear government prioritization of these sectors according to precisely those criteria. That this has made a really huge contribution to the balance of payment sustainability within Chile. And these are also sectors that employ many rural Chilean people. John.
Yes, I mean, in a way to summarize, or put in a broader context, the Chilean experience, this chart looks at public expenditure, largely sort of R&D, but other forms of subsidy as a share of agricultural GDP, and in constant dollar terms from 1980 to 2002. If you updated it, it wouldn't be any different, I think. I think perhaps the easiest and quickest thing is just to look at the red lines and look at the middle column, which is the 11 Asian high-performing economies. And what you see in the high-performing economies is the red line goes up very dramatically. And billions of dollars spent in public sector, public expenditure in agriculture. And the green line, as a percentage of their agricultural GDP, is also quite a lot higher than in Africa, which is on the left-hand side, where the red line is more or less flat, and the public expenditure as a percentage of agricultural GDP is also not very high and not growing very fast either. Mm. Latin America, mixed picture, but a greater amount of expenditure in terms of billions of dollars, constant dollars, and as a percentage of GDP. So one can cut this data in lots of different ways, but the story is always the same, that there's been a huge neglect of public sector expenditure on R&D in most sub-Saharan African countries, including, of course, South Africa, and successful economies spend a great deal more, both as a percentage of their agricultural GDP and in constant dollar terms.
So another way of looking at this is to say, well, look, what happens if you don't think in terms of the criteria that John highlighted earlier? What happens if you don't prioritize in this way? And to give you a couple of examples to do with the infrastructural implications of this. This is your two lecturers this morning having broken down on a really poor condition road, ungraded road that leads through the Upper Awash Valley in Ethiopia. And if you go along that road that you see behind you, it passes a number of really dynamic farms. So there are local Ethiopian farmers producing chilies, onions, horticultural output, whatever it may be. There are also flower farms. There are fruit farms like the passion fruit one that we talked about earlier. And further on down the road, there's a very, very large farm producing tomatoes and mangoes, which is massive actually. And it's run by the richest person in Ethiopia, Sheikh Alamoudi. Who has very close, or did have very close links to the state. And what was really, really interesting was that the government for years and years and years had promised to, but refused actually to grade this road. And what does it mean? It doesn't just mean a little bit of bother for us standing around in the heat, a little bit of inconvenience. No, it's actually rather more serious than that. And business owners along that road were telling us how, when they produced their sophisticated, complex, roundabout, intricate export output in the form, let's say, of pouches, vacuum sealed pouches of passion fruit pulp and juice, they lose a large amount of export value because of the state of this road, because it's so bumpy and it, wrenches the trucks left to right, and many of these pouches burst in the back, and then they rot and you've lost value. So the balance of payments in Ethiopia, and this is a country with a severe balance of payments chronic crisis that lies behind a lot of the political troubles, not to mention the economic troubles in recent years in Ethiopia. But the balance of payments is not being prioritized. Nobody was thinking enough about the criterion of investing in and supporting, through public spending on infrastructure, those activities that had a really high potential for increasing the rate of growth of export earnings, foreign exchange earnings in Ethiopia. Let's move to South Africa. What happens if you don't invest enough in infrastructure that enables the successful expansion of agricultural exports? This is the kind of slightly embarrassing thing that happens. You find that your ports don't look very good in comparative indices that rank them. So you see a World Bank index that puts the port of Cape Town 347th out of 351 container ports globally. And that's the best performing port in South Africa. Others placed even lower down that 2020 container port performance index. And serious bottlenecks at ports in South Africa have seriously undermined the export earnings and expansion and profitability, and therefore investment in these kinds of activities that we've been talking about. And you perhaps see that, we're coming to a close rather soon, you see that in some of the comparative data on agricultural exports. If you look here, the value of agricultural exports, which of those lines is South Africa? It's the one pottering along, flatlining at the bottom until about 2011, and rather different from the, okay, on this scale, it looks quite modest, but it's still significant increase in Malaysia and Indonesia. But look at the rate of expansion of agricultural export value in Brazil. If we run through these fast, John, we can go back to them if you want to briefly in a minute. Sure. We look specifically at the volume of avocado exports from South Africa. South Africa's a really effective producer of avocados, but wait, if we compare that to Mexico, or we compare it to Peru, you look at the recent expansion in avocado export volumes from Peru, for example. South Africa hasn't appeared to be doing quite as well as we perhaps had thought and hoped. We know that berry exports from South Africa have begun to take off and have been expanding recently, and there's a lot of potential. Again, the reality over a longer period of time, when we look in recent economic history, is that expansion is very, very limited. There is a lot of catching up to do with Peru, with Mexico, and above all, think of our Hernan Garcés example earlier about the cherries in Chile.
Before you go on, Chris.
Yeah, please go.
Just very quickly, when you look at charts like the berry chart or the avocado chart that we've just looked at, I want you to think about, the old themes of premising export pessimism, primary commodity production. There's not much hope for it. It's not going anywhere. You'd better get into manufacturing because primary commodities really, they won't do you much good. And the world trade system is skewed against primary commodity producers. Tell that to Peru or Chile. They've managed pretty well. And some African countries where their primary agricultural commodity exports have stagnated or fallen, basically the result of a few decades of following those sorts of policies have meant that their share of world markets, growing world markets for some of these primary commodities, has declined. So Africa's share of, for example, coffee production in the world has declined and has been completely taken over by Vietnam. And one could go through primary commodity after primary commodity and see that there were good opportunities which some countries adopted the policies which enabled them to succeed in grasping, and others didn't. So it's a policy issue. It's not some structural feature of inevitable pessimism about prospects for primary commodity or agricultural exports.
There's one more point we want to make. We want to leave some time for questions and discussion. But John, I wonder if you can bring us to a close. There's one more. We've talked about the balance of payments dimension of policy, but there's the other one that we mentioned, which is about employment.
Yeah, it's the importance of wage employment. It happens to be a feature of many of these high-value agricultural commodity exports that they are very labor-intensive. They employ a lot of people. That's per hectare, per dollar invested, per unit of output. They are very labor-intensive activities. If you look at if you move over to the next chart, what this chart suggests, if you look at the timeline, it's that going up to 2050, there are going to be large numbers of new entrants into the rural labor markets of sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, there'll be growing numbers, which is the gray bit of the column, into urban labor markets, but in absolute terms and as a percentage of all entrants, rural labor markets continue to be incredibly important right up to 2050. That applies in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, but in almost every country within sub-Saharan Africa. So the growth of population and the distribution of population and any conceivable growth in rural-urban migration still means that close to half of all entrants into the labor market and many millions of new entrants into the labor market will be rural. So if you want to do something about employment, you really have to do something about rural wage employment.
And when we want to kind of explode one final myth, it's not just rural self-employment. John?
Yeah. Well, why do we keep on talking about wage labor and the importance of wage labor intensity of these particular agricultural activities? It's because of, if you like, a general background thing that I think all development economists should have very close to, should pay a great deal of attention to. And that is, put very simply, that if you look at rich countries, if you look at countries that are successful in achieving high levels of welfare on average for most of their population, by that I mean America, the EU 28, and a few of the richer Latin America developing countries, their labor market has a particular characteristic which needs stressing. Most of the people who are engaged in the labor market are wage employed, and a tiny proportion are self-employed. Self-employment is not important in economies that do well. And I think one can make a general statement about structural change to end with, if you like, which is just as important as the one that we began with. That is, that as economies develop, a larger and larger proportion of the population is employed outside agriculture. But as economies develop, a larger and larger proportion of the population is wage employed. The point about all our fuss about what is agriculture, what isn't agriculture, how do you define the boundaries, is that we want to argue that because of the industrialization of freshness, a great deal of wage employment, there are good prospects for increasing wage employment in a highly sophisticated, industrialized, if you like, agricultural activities.
Great. I think that's a fantastic note for us to end on, and we should stop there. You know, what we're arguing is that if you take this things that we've summarized in the phrase the industrialization of freshness seriously, you find that there is a huge scope for policy to be designed to try and promote activities that can contribute, especially to the balance of payments in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries, and to the rate of growth of wage employment, particularly in rural areas. So let's stop there.